In the heart of the 1980s, in a town so small its heartbeat was the gossip at the diner, something sinister began to stir. Here, where the streets were lined with familiar faces and the air was thick with the scent of pine and secrecy, teenagers started to vanish. One by one, like whispers in the wind, they disappeared without a trace. At first, the townsfolk shrugged it off. Teenagers, they thought, always looking for an escape from the mundane. Perhaps they had simply run away. But the laughter in the high school hallways grew quieter. The joy at the local fairgrounds dimmed, and the sense of unease crept into every home. Then, one chilly autumn morning, the body of one of these lost souls was found. Not just gone, but violently taken. The scene was gruesome, a stark contrast to the picturesque town setting. The victim, a bright-eyed girl with dreams too big for this small world, lay cold and still, her life brutally cut short. Panic didn't just seep into the town, it flooded it. The once tight-knit community, where doors were left unlocked, now locked their hearts as much as their homes. The local sheriff, overwhelmed and under-resourced, seemed to fumble in the dark, his reassurances hollow against the backdrop of fear. Enter Tom, a local journalist, whose passion for truth was as relentless as the town's growing dread. With a notebook in hand and a fire in his belly, Tom began to peel back the layers of this seemingly tranquil town. What he uncovered was not just a series of unfortunate events, but a tapestry of dark secrets, woven deep into the fabric of the community. As Tom dug deeper, he realized that in this town, everyone was a suspect. And everyone had something to hide. The connections between the victims were not obvious, but they were there, hidden beneath layers of silence and lies. The town's facade of normalcy was a mask, and behind it, a chilling narrative unfolded, revealing that the real monsters were not lurking in the shadows, but walking among them, smiling at Sunday service and sitting at the diner's counter. This is not just a story of disappearances. It's a tale of how a community's silence can be its own kind of violence, and how the truth, once unleashed, can change everything. Tom's first lead came from an unlikely source, a faded, yellowed newspaper clipping from decades ago, tucked away in the archives of the local library. It spoke of another series of disappearances, eerily similar to the current ones, but the story had been buried, forgotten by time or perhaps by design. He sat at the library, the musty scent of old books filling his senses as he pieced together the past with the present. Each name he read, each face he imagined, felt like a ghost whispering through the pages, urging him to uncover their truth. His next step was to visit the home of the latest victim, Sarah, whose vibrant life had been extinguished too soon. Her mother, Mrs. Jenkins, sat in a dimly lit living room, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of her daughter. "She was going to be something, you know," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice breaking. "She had plans, dreams. And now, this town, it's like it swallowed her whole." Tom nodded, his heart heavy. "Mrs. Jenkins, did Sarah ever mention anything strange, anyone she might have been afraid of?" The room fell silent, save for the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Mrs. Jenkins' gaze drifted to the window, as if searching for her daughter in the shadows of the evening. "There was this one time, she mentioned seeing someone watching her from the woods, but she laughed it off, said she was just being silly." Tom's pen paused over his notebook. "The woods. Did she say anything else about it?" "Not much, just that it was near the old miller's place, but everyone knows that house has been abandoned for years." The mention of the miller's place sent a chill down Tom's spine. It was a local legend, a decrepit mansion on the edge of town, rumored to be cursed or haunted, but now, perhaps, it held more than just stories. Tom's investigation took him to the outskirts of town, where the forest thickened and the light seemed to dim even in the daylight. The miller's place loomed like a specter, its windows dark, its walls overgrown with ivy, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim it. He approached cautiously, each step echoing his heartbeat. The air felt heavier here, laden with secrets. Pushing open the creaky gate, he made his way to the front door, which surprisingly gave way with a gentle push. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced through the boarded windows. As he explored, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood underfoot. In what must have been a living room, he found signs of recent disturbance. Footprints in the dust, a chair out of place. His pulse quickened. Then in the corner, half hidden by an old, moth-eaten curtain, he found it, a collection of items that didn't belong in this time-forgotten place. A hair tie, a notebook with doodles and notes, a small locket with a picture of a young girl. Tom's mind raced. These were not just items, they were clues, connections to the missing, to Sarah. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of uncovering a piece of the puzzle, but also the weight of the darkness he was stepping into. This was no longer just a story for the paper. It was a descent into the heart of a town's darkest secrets, where every shadow could hide a truth or a lie, and every whisper could be a clue or a warning. Tom carefully cataloged each item, his journalist's instinct telling him these were more than mere objects. They were silent witnesses to a tragedy. He photographed them, his camera's flash briefly illuminating the dark room like a lightning strike. Outside, the sky was turning a deep shade of twilight, and Tom knew he had to move fast. He returned to town, his mind buzzing with theories and questions. The next morning, he went straight to the sheriff's office, his findings tucked under his arm. Sheriff Danvers was a man of routine, his office cluttered with files and old coffee cups, a stark contrast to the neatness of his uniform. He looked up as Tom entered, his expression one of weary skepticism. "Tom, what brings you here at this ungodly hour?" Danvers asked, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "I found something at the Miller's place," Tom said, laying out the photographs. "These items, they belong to the missing kids." Danvers leaned forward, his interest piqued despite himself. He examined the photos, his face hardening. "And you think this is connected to the disappearances?" "I know it is," Tom replied firmly. "There's more. I found a connection to a similar case from the 50s, the same pattern, the same type of victims." The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Tom, you're digging up old ghosts. What do you expect me to do with this?" "Investigate," Tom insisted. "This isn't just about the past. It's happening now, and it's going to happen again unless we stop it." Danvers nodded slowly, his reluctance giving way to a grim determination. "All right, we'll check out the Miller's place. But you need to be careful, Tom. This town has layers of secrets that aren't meant to be disturbed." As the sheriff organized a search party, Tom felt a mix of relief and dread. He knew he was on the right track, but the path was fraught with danger. He spent the day following up on other leads, talking to friends of the victims, piecing together their last known movements. One name kept surfacing in his conversations. Carl Miller, the last known resident of the Miller's place. He had been a recluse, a figure of local lore, but no one had seen him in years. Was he still alive? Or had someone else taken up residence in his shadow? That evening, Tom sat in his small, cluttered office at the local newspaper, surrounded by clippings, notes, and the hum of the old typewriter. The phone rang, breaking his concentration. It was an anonymous tip, the voice distorted, whispering about a meeting at the old mill on the outskirts of town, a place long abandoned but rumored to be used for secretive gatherings. Tom's pulse raced. This could be the break he needed. He grabbed his camera and a flashlight, the weight of his recorder heavy in his pocket. The mill was a relic of the town's industrial past, now just a skeleton of rust and decay, surrounded by dense woods. As he approached, the night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The mill stood silent, its silhouette ominous against the moonlit sky. Tom moved cautiously, his senses heightened, every sound amplified in the quiet. Inside, the mill was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes. He heard voices faint at first, then clearer as he drew closer. Peering around a corner, he saw figures, their faces obscured by the dim light. They were talking, their tones urgent, about the plan and the next one. Tom's finger hovered over the camera's shutter, ready to capture evidence when a hand clamped over his mouth, pulling him back into the darkness. He struggled, but the grip was firm, and a voice hissed in his ear. "You shouldn't have come here, Tom." The world spun as he was dragged away from the light, into the deeper shadows of the mill, where secrets were not just buried but actively guarded. His last thought before everything went black was of the town's facade cracking, revealing not just secrets, but a conspiracy woven into the very fabric of its existence. Tom awoke with a start, his head throbbing, the taste of blood in his mouth. The darkness was absolute, save for a sliver of light creeping under what he assumed was a door. His hands were bound behind his back, the rough rope cutting into his wrists. He tried to move, to shout, but his voice came out muffled, his mouth gagged with what felt like a rag. The room was cold, the air stale with the scent of mold and decay. He could hear the distant drip of water, the sound echoing in the confined space. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from fear, but from the realization that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than he had anticipated. Suddenly, the door creaked open, casting a harsh rectangle of light across the floor. Silhouetted against it was a figure, tall and imposing. Tom squinted against the light, trying to make out the face, but it remained shadowed. "You've been asking too many questions, Mr. Tom," the figure said, his voice calm yet carrying an edge of menace. "This town has a way of dealing with those who pry too deep." Tom struggled against his bindings, his muffled protests growing more frantic. The figure stepped closer, the light now revealing the face of Sheriff Danvers, his expression unreadable. "Danvers?" Tom's voice was a hoarse whisper through the gag. "You?" The sheriff sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting down, his face now in full view. "I told you, Tom, some secrets aren't meant to be disturbed, but you didn't listen. Now look where that's gotten you." Tom's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of his investigation. "It was you all along? The disappearances, the cover-ups?" "Not me alone," Danvers corrected, his voice low. "This town. It has its ways. We protect our own. Sometimes, that means making hard choices." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. The sheriff, the very man sworn to protect and serve, was part of the darkness enveloping this town. And Sarah, was she just another hard choice? Danvers' face twitched, a flicker of regret or perhaps something darker. Sarah was an unfortunate necessity. She saw too much, like you. Tom's anger surged, giving him strength. "You can't just silence everyone who gets close to the truth. People will find out. They'll know." "Perhaps," Danvers admitted, standing up. "But by then, it'll be too late for you." The door opened again, and another figure entered, this one smaller, more hesitant. It was Mrs. Jenkins, her face pale, eyes red from crying. She looked at Tom, her expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "Mrs. Jenkins, please," Tom pleaded, his voice breaking. "You know this isn't right." She didn't respond, just stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding back a storm of emotions. Danvers moved towards the door. "We'll deal with him quietly, like the others." As the sheriff stepped out, Mrs. Jenkins lingered, her gaze locked on Tom. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "For Sarah, for all of them. But this town, it consumes us all." Before Tom could respond, she turned and left, closing the door with a finality that echoed in the small room. The light vanished, plunging Tom back into darkness. But now, the silence was different. It was laden with the weight of betrayal, of a community's complicity in its own decay. Tom lay there, the room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing against his thoughts, each breath a struggle against the gag. The darkness was not just an absence of light, but a presence, a cloak over the town's conscience. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Tom's mind racing through every conversation, every clue, every face he had encountered in his investigation. The realization that the town's pillars, the very people meant to uphold justice, were complicit in this horror, was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical pain. Suddenly, a soft noise, almost imperceptible, broke the silence. A shuffle, a whisper of fabric against concrete. Tom strained his ears, his heart pounding. The door creaked again, slower this time, and a figure slipped in, barely visible in the dim light. "Tom." The voice was hushed, urgent. It was Mrs. Jenkins, her silhouette trembling. "I can't. I won't let this happen again." She moved quickly to his side, her hands fumbling with the knots binding him. "I thought I could live with it, for Sarah, for my peace. But no more. This ends now." As the ropes loosened, Tom felt a surge of adrenaline, his hands tingling as blood rushed back into them. He pulled the gag from his mouth, gasping for air. "Mrs. Jenkins, why now?" She paused, her eyes meeting his, filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "Because I saw the truth in your eyes, Tom. You're not like them. You care about what's right, not just what's easy." With his hands free, Tom rubbed his wrists, feeling the raw skin where the ropes had bitten. "We need to get out of here, warn others. This isn't just about me or the missing kids. It's about the soul of this town." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, helping him to his feet. "There's a back way, less guarded, but we must be quick." They moved silently through the mill, the shadows now allies in their escape. Each step was cautious, each sound a potential alarm. The mill, once a place of industry, was now a maze of deceit and hidden truths. As they neared an exit, a voice echoed through the empty halls. "Where do you think you're going, Mrs. Jenkins?" They froze. Sheriff Danvers stood at the end of the corridor, his silhouette framed by the moonlight filtering through a broken window. His voice was cold, devoid of the earlier pretense of camaraderie. "You've made your choice, then?" Danvers asked, his hand resting on his gun. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Yes, Danvers, I choose justice over silence. I choose to end this nightmare." For a moment there was silence, the tension palpable, like the air before a storm. Then, with a resigned sigh, Danvers lowered his hand. "You realize what this means? There's no going back." "I know," she replied, her voice firm, "and I'm ready." Tom, now standing beside her, felt a surge of respect and a flicker of hope. "We'll expose this, Sheriff. The whole town, the whole world will know." Danvers looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Then go. But remember, this town has long arms. You might escape tonight, but there's always a price for betrayal." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing ominously. Mrs. Jenkins and Tom didn't wait to see if he would change his mind. They slipped out into the night, the cold air a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere they left behind. As they emerged from the mill, the night was eerily quiet, the town asleep under a blanket of stars. They moved swiftly, their steps silent on the dew-laden grass, the urgency of their escape fueling their pace. The darkness, once a harbinger of fear, now shielded them as they made their way towards the town's edge. Tom's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each step forward a step into the unknown. The betrayal of Sheriff Danvers, the complicity of the townsfolk, and the courage of Mrs. Jenkins to defy the darkness that had consumed her daughter. It was all too much, yet it was the reality they now faced. "We need to get to the newspaper office," Tom whispered, his voice still raw from the gag. "I have everything we need there. Photos, notes, everything." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her resolve hardening with each step. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. For Sarah, for all of them." They reached the back alley behind the newspaper office, the familiar sight of the old building offering a semblance of safety. Tom unlocked the door, the familiar creak of the hinges a welcome sound. Inside, the office. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.